I have to admit that when I learned that the theme for the month of April was resistance, the first thing that came to my mind was that line from the old Star Trek series, "Resistance is futile." I have to confess, I've never been a Trekkie, so that, along with "beam me up, Scotty," that "resistance is futile" phrase is about all I know about Star Trek. In fact, I sometimes get Star Trek confused with Star Wars. I know, forgive me. Even within Star Trek, my knowledge of the characters can be a little shaky. Many years ago, when I was a graduate student at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, I was a teaching assistant to Professor Wayne Elsie, whose academic specialty was religion and popular culture. He was interested in how the stories and symbols of a supposedly secular society, especially in the mass media, mirrored ancient myths and images and ideas. So one day he sent me to the library to gather some books and articles, books and journals for an article that he was going to write. And I dove into the task enthusiastically, returned at the end of the day like an eager Springer Spaniel dropping a duck at his master's feet. I deposited a stack of material on Professor Elsie's desk, books, journals, photocopied journal articles, and so forth. And he looked at it and he said, "What's all this stuff about Mr. Spock?" I said, "Dr. Spock." So he saw Dr. Spock, Dr. Benjamin Spock, as a kind of secular saint, beloved by millions of mothers in the 1950s and 60s, and then achieving a second career, if you will, as a protester, as a presidential candidate and protester of the Vietnam War. I don't know. I guess I thought Leonard Nimoy's character had somehow earned a doctoral degree, so he was also Dr. Spock. He was so smart, he had to be a doctor. So I was a little fuzzy about I am a little fuzzy about some aspects of the story. But I do remember that line, "Resistance is futile." Resistance is futile. It's a terrifying phrase, really. And it's meant to be terrifying. You will be assimilated. There's nothing you can do about it. There is no possibility that you will avoid being overcome and conquered. You may as well just give up. That slogan, or something like it, sometimes in kinder and gentler forms, but that sentiment is common to all domination systems throughout history. As the ancient Greek historian Thucydides put it in his account of the Peloponnesian War, the so-called Melian dialogue, which is really more of a monologue, with the conquering Athenians saying, "The strong do as they will, and the weak suffer what they must." The way things are is presented as inevitable, whether that's determined by the will of God, the dictates of science, or by the iron law of history. The way things are is the way they have to be. Former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher exemplified that attitude when she said, with regard to the neoliberal capitalist economic order, she coined the acronym TINA, T-I-N-A, there is no alternative. So even the moral imagination is precluded from envisioning alternatives in that scenario. So is resistance really futile? Is that what Jesus meant when he said, "Resist not evil, turn the other cheek," and all the rest? I want to unpack that with a few verses for a few minutes, and then we can open it up for some conversation afterward. One of my beloved teachers and mentors was a New Testament scholar named Walter Wink, and he said that the passage that I read to you earlier one of the most misunderstood passages in all of the Bible. The counsel to turn the other cheek has come to imply a kind of doormat mentality. It seems to counsel submission. It breaks the nerve of any resistance to evil. Seeing and many people have simply concluded that the teaching is impractical, it's masochistic, even suicidal. It's an open invitation to bullies and batterers to have their way. Of course, that's not what Jesus meant. He never displayed that kind of passivity in his own ethical passivity in his life, but rather confronted evil at every turn. But with a difference. And here's where Walter Wink said he exemplified what he calls a third way, that evil can be opposed without mirroring our opponent and becoming the very thing we hate. The Greek word translated in the text as resist is antistenai, which literally means to stand against. And it was a technical term for warfare. It described the way that armies clashed and marched against each other in battle. It's not so much mistranslated, Wink said, as it is undertranslated. To really convey the meaning of that word, it would have to include the connotations of violent revolt, rebellion, and armed insurrection. And saying, do not antistenai one who is evil, Jesus is not telling his disciples to simply submit to evil, but not to oppose it on its own terms, but rather to engage it creatively, to engage in what I call creative resistance. Jesus is trying to break the spiral of violence. Don't resist one who is evil probably meant something like, don't turn into the very thing you hate. Don't become what you oppose. As the Apostle Paul later said, do not return evil for evil. So let me see if I can unpack that a little more. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, he says. And by the way, he's not addressing those who do the striking. He says, if anyone strikes you, his audience, the listeners, are those who are themselves the victims of being struck. If anyone wants to strike you, sue you, force you to go 1 mile. But Wink pointed out one significant detail in Matthew's text. Someone strikes you on the right cheek. Why would that be important? In order to demonstrate that, I'm going to need a couple helpers. I'm wondering, maybe Jacob and David, I know you're willing to come up, if you'd be willing to come up and help me with this a little bit. I know you'll volunteer. I knew you would. And just stand up here. I'm going to turn this down for now. If you can stand up on the dais, yeah. So people can see and face each other. Okay, good. Thank you. So, yeah, and nobody will be hurt during this. I want to be clear about that. I want you to imagine if David were the assailant, and all of this is done in slow motion, no contact form. But if you were the assailant and you wanted to strike a blow to Jacob's with your right fist to Jacob's face, which cheek would it land on? Strike with your right hand. Okay, on the left cheek. So that's the wrong cheek in terms of this text. Jesus says, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek. You could hit him on the right cheek. If you used a left hook, you can demonstrate that. But that would be impossible in Jesus's culture because the left hand was used only for unclean tasks. You couldn't even gesture with your left hand in the Qumran community at the time. If you gestured at someone with your left hand, you were kicked out of the community for 10 days to do penance. So it was taken quite seriously, that taboo. So the only way that you could hit Jacob on the right cheek would be with the back of your right hand. See if you can demonstrate that. So what we're dealing with here is not a fist fight. It's an insult. Only equals fought each other with fists. The intention here is not to injure, but to humiliate, to put someone in their place. It was about asserting dominance, pure and simple. You would never strike your peers in this way. And if you did, the consequences were severe. Again, the Mishnah, a Jewish legal code of around this time, stipulated a fine of 5 zuz for slugging an equal, 200 zuz for slapping an equal, 400 for a backhanded slap, like we just saw. A zuz, by the way, was a day's wage. 400 days' wages if you broke the norms of the social hierarchy by being so presumptuous as to insult someone who's your social equal with a backhanded slap. That was the way of admonishing those thought to be inferior. Masters, backhanded slaves, husbands, wives, parents, children, men, women, Romans, Jews. All unequal relationships in which retaliation in kind would invite retribution. So the normal response to that kind of treatment was cowering submission. Resistance was futile, it seemed. And among Jesus's listeners were those who had been humiliated in just this way by the domination system as a result of the imperial occupation. Yeah, I think you guys, thank you. I think you can have your seats now. Although you could have shown this last action, I'll describe it. So the action of turning the other cheek is to come around front, to come and face the person who is striking you. It robs the oppressor of the power to humiliate. Not the power to injure, even the power to kill, frankly, but it robs them of that. It forces that person to see you as a social equal. I deny you the power to humiliate me. I'm a human being just like you. Your status does not affect that fact. You cannot demean me. Furthermore, Wink pointed out, you can't really backhand someone twice. It's like telling a joke a second time. If it doesn't work the first time, you failed. So by turning the other cheek, you are defiantly saying to the person, I refuse to be humiliated by you any longer. So clearly, this is not a way to avoid trouble, to dodge trouble. The master, in the case of a master and slave relationship, might have you flogged within an inch of your life, but he will never be able to assert that you have no dignity. And in that honor-shame society, what anthropologists call an honor-shame culture, that person has been rendered impotent to instill shame. Mahatma Gandhi said the first principle of nonviolent action is that of non-cooperation with everything humiliating. So the principle of nonviolent action is at stake here. It certainly wasn't invented by Jesus. In fact, in his lifetime, shortly after Pontius Pilate was appointed procurator, Jews in Jerusalem were offended by the installation of images in the temple area. And they had a nonviolent protest in which they literally said, we'd rather die than have this insult to our heritage. And together, hundreds laid down and exposed their necks, said, we'd rather have you executed. And Pilate backed off as a result of that remarkable nonviolent protest. So Jesus was aware of that. What was different or distinctive is that he was elevating it from a kind of occasional and spontaneous occurrence to a central element in his program of inaugurating what he called the kingdom of God. So turning the other cheek was not a way to avoid trouble. This cheeky behavior, if you will, could call down punishment. I want to be clear about that. But the point is, it was an overcoming of an ingrained sense of shame and inferiority. How different is that from the usual interpretation of this text among both religious people and secular people? Very, very different understanding. Yesterday, some of you may know, was Jackie Robinson Day. We watched a little baseball on television last night. All the players on every team in Major League Baseball wore uniforms with the iconic number 42, commemorating the day that Jackie Robinson broke the Major League color barrier on April 15th, 1947, when then Brooklyn Dodger manager Branch Rickey, as he was planning this, and it was well planned, he made Robinson promise that he would refrain from retaliating to all the insults he would suffer during the first 3 years. And Robinson said, "Mr. Rickey, are you looking for a Negro who is afraid to fight back?" And Rickey replied, "I'm looking for a ball player with guts enough not to fight back." And Robinson kept that promise, even though, his experience in those first few years was horrific. I don't need to go into the details. You can look it up. I encourage you to do that. It's a remarkable story of resistance. Imagine speaking of resistance, the inner resistance that he had to summon up and sustain to overcome that kind of abuse. So, turn the other cheek doesn't mean what you might think. The second instance Jesus gives in this story: if anyone takes you to court and sues you for your outer garment, give them your undergarment as well. And I'm not going to ask for people to help with this one. But the situation here envisions a courtroom scene where the cloak is actually collateral for a loan that was made. What's the word for a very, very, very marginal loan? You can imagine someone who's so poor that the only thing they can offer for collateral, for enough loan to maybe buy some seeds or some food or whatever, the only collateral they can offer is this outer garment that was everyone, there wasn't a lot of diversity in fashion, but this outer garment, this cloak, was used also to sleep in at night. It was a blanket, doubled as a blanket. And then under that there was a lighter garment that everyone wore. So Jesus is saying basically in court, and again, be reminded, his audience is made up of people who have been through this kind of thing. They're very familiar with this, where the creditor takes this person who's on the very margins of survival, really, so poor that this is the only thing they can offer as collateral. And it's allowed for. There are texts in the book of Deuteronomy that envision this same thing. I'll read it, actually, Deuteronomy 24. It says, if you take your neighbor's cloak in pawn for collateral, you shall restore it before the sun goes down, for it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as a cover. What else can that person sleep with for a blanket? And if your neighbor cries out to me, that is to God, I will listen, for I am compassionate. So this very scenario is familiar. The idea of this desperate fringe of survival kind of situation. And in that, someone would have the greed, the arrogance, the dominance to take that person to court to get that cloak as in return for the loan, which hasn't been paid back. So in that situation, they're probably not going to, if that were the case, they probably wouldn't win the court case, this poor person. But what he is envisioning, the picture he's painting, is one in which this person would be to give them, they're required to give their cloak, which was their collateral, give them your other garment as well. The result was you would be standing there naked in court. People didn't wear, boxer shorts back then. You would be naked in court. And the nakedness was such a taboo, but it was not the primary shame, or fell upon not the person who was naked, but the person who had caused that nakedness. And we don't have time to get into it, but there are a number of stories that illustrate that. It's the one who causes the nakedness who is shamed. So it's a bit of what we might call street theater. In that court, you are exposing the nakedness of the system, if you will. What kind of a system is it or society is it where someone has to live on that kind of fringe? So again, he's asserting dignity and equality, using this. It is an example of street theater. Gonna have to rush ahead here. You want my robe? Have it, and take this as well. Now all you've got is my body. I suppose that's what you want next. This is the kind of political theater that I think was envisioned in this little story. It's not giving up on the claims of justice, but it's a dramatic unmasking of the creditor and an unveiling of the nakedness of that domination system. In recent years, and especially in specific cultural contexts in Africa, women have ingeniously used tactical displays of nakedness in various protest movements. Cornell professor Namanita Diabate wrote a book called Naked Agency, in which she says she was inspired by African women who often live in challenging material conditions and yet find strength to carve out, albeit temporarily, a space of resistance using that which is their last resort. So even in the last resort, there is a way to resist in a creative fashion. Because we're at the hour here, I think I'm going to skip the third example, which has a story about carrying Roman soldiers. It envisions a scenario where a civilian is impressed into carrying a heavy backpack for a Roman soldier, and there's a real story there as well. It is interesting that Gandhi said, "Everyone in the world knows that Jesus and his teaching is nonviolent, except Christians." What Jesus is articulating here is a way of living in the world without violence, but a way of overcoming domination in all its forms by using a way that will not create new forms of violence. In the past, we thought we had only two choices: resist evil or don't resist evil. And Wink is talking about a third way here. And by the way, Wink was very involved in the era of the ending of apartheid in South Africa. These statements in the Sermon on the Mount are not laws to be repeated mechanically, kind of like a joke. You can't repeatedly just go back to the same playbook as if it's just a simple formula to be applied. The idea is he's trying to provoke an attitude or a spirit of creative nonviolent resistance, and those are examples of how that might be done. Non-cooperation with evil, said Martin Luther King, is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good.